Hello everybody, in this video we're going to be looking at the Maroczy Bind in the Sicilian defence. Now the Maroczy Bind is the name given when we reach the position after e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, pawn takes, knight takes. And if black allows this to happen, with a move like g6, we can go into the Maroczy bind with c4. So the characteristic of the Maroczy is white having two pawns on c4 and e4, and typically a knight on d4. So the feature of this position is that white has a slight space advantage with all these pieces on the fourth rank. Good control of the light squares because of the knight and pawns controlling b5, d5 and f5, as well as other light squares. And black generally has control of the dark squares, as now c5 and e5 are under black's control. And white is going to try and use the space advantage to their own advantage, and black is going to try and target the weak dark squares. Usually d4 is a key square for black to control. Note that black doesn't have to allow a Maroczy bind. For example, in this position, instead of g6, a move like knight f6 pretty much forces knight c3, and then we have a regular Sicilian without there being a Maroczy bind. So this opening has been around quite a long time, and there are many players who think that white is just better with this structure, but there are also a good number of players who like black's possible counter chances. So in this opening, usually black fianchettos with g6 and bishop g7. White now plays knight c3, so again both knights controlling light squares. Knight f6, and now white usually just places the bishops on the e-file, with black getting on with development and castling. And one of the features of this position is that black is going to play this like a hedgehog formation. Black is going to try and play for d5, b5, and any other pawn breaks that are appropriate. But in this Sicilian line of the Maroczy, black often has very good chances to exchange pieces. And if you can do it early, then all the better. So knight c6, very common. And white isn't too afraid of exchanging the knights because then after bishop takes d4, possibly white could trade off the dark squared bishops, which would allow white's dark squares not to be as weak anymore. So white would normally castle, and a6 is a very common move. It just clamps down on b5, preventing white from putting a knight there. Later on, black might be able to play b5 themselves, so that would free up space on the queen side for black to expand and counterattack. And white normally tries to play this fairly aggressively in the Sicilian with a move like f4. Again, not the only move. There are other moves such as knight takes c6 and even knight d5, but they tend to be a lot less popular. And black has a huge variety of choices. Queen b6 is seen in some lines of the Sicilian, but here I would strongly advise against it, because as white has got all this space and very good development, black doesn't really have enough time to go about grabbing the pawn. So here white can play knight f5, which defends the bishop on e3, and also you're threatening to take on g7, getting rid of the dragon bishop. So black's only reason for playing queen b6 is queen takes b2, but this can become very unpleasant very quickly after knight a4, queen a3, and note how few squares the queen has to move to. So bishop c1, queen b4, bishop d2, and there's only one square the queen can go to, a3, rook f3, and now black is just losing the queen. So queen takes rook, Zwischenzug with knight e7 check, knight takes, and bishop takes. And here the computer is very generous to black and only gives it as plus about 3 or 4 points according to my engine, but I would give it as significantly more than that. Black's structure is in ruins and the material deficit's just too much. This should be winning for white quite easily. So going back, queen b6 is not the right plan in this position. Again, it's all about exchanging pieces and playing for pawn breaks. So the two candidate moves are bishop d7 is seen quite a lot, especially in club chess. It's just a useful way of finding a good place for the bishop. Play knight takes d4 and then bishop c6. So white continues development. And after a move like rook c8, one of the troubles black has is that d5 and b5 are not really viable moves. So after white retreats with the knight, black can keep on playing like a hedgehog, but white is eventually going to use this space advantage very effectively. For example, here, white could throw caution to the winds with g5, and the only move I could find for black which justifies the last few moves is the pawn break e5, which first you need to just stop g5 from white because the knight on f6 would then be devoid of squares. Rook f2 and e5. So here black has achieved a pawn break, but the d6 pawn is weak, the d5 square is weak, and white doesn't have to take the pawn. Generally, this pawn structure with f5 is very good for white. This little triangle, e4, f5, g4, is going to give white lots of space, plenty of sacrificing opportunities, and also just clamps down on the light squares. So I would say white is just completely winning in this line. For example, after queen c7, knight d5, and if the queen moves, then b6 is dropping off, and if black takes with the knight, c takes d5, and black has lost a piece. So going back, bishop d7 would only be a good line if black took on d4 immediately. Then maybe there's something for black. But again, it still is a little bit dodgy in this position. Perhaps knight d5 is the best move here. And after knight takes, c takes, bishop takes, queen takes, bishop d7, white's mobility is just, I think, winning. Rook c3, rook c8, rook fc1. So here, although a lot of the pieces have been traded off, and white's space advantage isn't quite as important anymore. White's piece mobility is the key factor here. So I feel that a well-timed e5 push, or even throwing up the queenside pawns, would be very good for white. So going back, the critical line in the Maroczy, Sicilian, is not bishop d7, it's actually knight g4. Now this goes to the idea of exchanging pieces quickly, and black has already now developed practically everything apart from the bishop on c8, which is doing a perfectly good job protecting g4. And this seeks to not really play for a pawn break early, it's seeking to use piece play to swap things off first, and then arrange the pawn structure to black's benefit. So the computer line given is bishop takes knight, bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, queen takes g4, knight takes d4. And after rook a d1, black has a couple of choices, but here I would give black some. I wouldn't say black is losing here, but black is a little bit worse, which is just generally what you have to accept sometimes when you're playing black. But there are certainly counter chances here. There's even queen b6 later on, but a move like knight c6 is perfectly good here, and I would say that now white's advantage is very minimal. Knight d5 may clamp down a little bit and give black a couple of problems to deal with, but overall I think this is the most favourable line for black in the Maroczy bind. Again, just swapping off pieces, not weakening your pawn structure, keeping everything solid is how to play. Don't panic and lunge forward with pawns. And with white, that's the same is true. If white chucks pawns up in a pawn storm, often black has counter chances in the centre. So I hope you enjoyed this video, hope you got something from it concerning the Maroczy bind, and comment, like, subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.